Good afternoon, everyone. This is Caitlin from TechServe Alliance, and welcome to today's webinar, Settle Smart, Defining Your Priorities for More Authentic Leadership. There will be a question and answer session after the presentation, so feel free to write in any questions you want answered in the question box on the right side of your screen. We are also recording today's presentation, which will be available to TechServe members on the TechServe Alliance website and will be sent out in follow-up emails. And with that, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Dana Cook-Arimoto, founder and CEO of Phoenix 5. Dana?
Thanks, Caitlin. Hi, everybody. It's so weird being able to not see you when you can see me, but I do these pretty frequently, so I'll do my best not to get distracted looking at myself while I'm also thinking about the wisdom I'm going to do my best to impart to you. So let's roll. Caitlin, if you want to move to the next slide, please. So Stop Settling, Settle Smart is actually the title of my new book, but also 23-year journey in staffing. Many of you know me from my career either in the industry or in strategy, working at Staffing Industry Analyst for 6 years and certainly partnering with TechServe over the last decade or so. And I'm always so appreciative of TechServe and all that they do for their members. So it's great to talk to you today about the message. So today's agenda, in an hour's time, will include an introduction to authentic leadership in several different flavors. Ideally, you will walk away with 1 or 2 or 3 key tidbits or nuggets that you can implement immediately within your organization and with your teams. And then we'll talk about how to make conscious decisions and trade-offs so that you aren't settling unless settling is something that works for you, and how to impart that even further down and out into your organization holistically so that engagement and loyalty increases, which is the third piece that we'll talk about. And then we'll have time for Q&A. And if you have questions throughout, I know you can chat them and we'll get to them at the end. So let's go. So there are many different models of authentic leadership. This particular model is from Bill George. Many of you knew him from his Medtronic run, where he took that company as CEO from a $1 billion market cap to a $460 billion market cap over a 12-year journey. That's a compounded annual growth rate for the CFO types on the phone of 35% a year. And he actually talked about these critical areas of passion and your behavior and the way that you actually are connected to people and the consistency that you exemplify, and also how your compassion for your team and others and yourselves and even your families beyond your workplace starts to eke back into the workplace and vice versa, and that duality that we all live in with purpose and values and heart and relationships and self-discipline, really, which is where you can be consistent. So he really introduced a long time ago, back in 2003 with his book on authentic leadership, this concept of lasting value for an organization, measured by things like certainly revenue and EBITDA and growth, but also measured by employee engagement and loyalty. And back in 2003, for those of you that have been running your own businesses or working in staffing or any business for that matter since that period of time, we know that as the economic cycles change, it's easy to get lost in the emotional intelligence, and the soft skills maybe don't count as much because we're running hard for numbers. But Bill was really insightful and ahead of his time in sharing that. In fact, it's the two of these components together that really make for an organization that has longevity in all the right ways. And if you can go to the next slide, then we can also look at servant leadership. I do a lot of executive coaching and leadership team development now that I'm out with my own business the last 2.5 years, and I've come out of running companies and staffing. And servant leadership, I see it all the time. There's so much heart and passion, especially in our line of work, because we're in the business of placing people and impacting lives. And that's irrelevant if you're tech and engineering and IT or light industrial. That's a universal truth. We're really impacting people's lives, the lives of our clients and the lives of our candidates. So servant leadership came to us in 1970 originally by a gentleman named Robert Greenleaf. I always want to call him Thomas because there's another author named Thomas Greenleaf. So Robert Greenleaf in 1970 introduced the concept. And there are these critical elements of being a servant leader, which many of you subscribe to. Listening, not just hearing, but actually listening to your teams and your clients and your candidates. Empathy, the ability to feel what other people feel and getting on their side of things, even when there's conflict. Healing, that was really creative for a business context. What does healing mean in a business context? Well, what it means is that we're able to get past things with unity and collaboration, and it's a really important component to being a servant leader. Then we have awareness. A lot of times I will work with companies that aren't really in people's heads. And I don't remember who wrote this book, but it was so long ago. It was one of the first business books I read when I was a new manager at Robert Half. I went from being a top salesperson to a manager because a lot of times that's the trajectory that we use in staffing. We take our top salespeople and we make them managers. Like poof, you're a manager. We don't really give them a lot of training. We kind of throw them in. Some of the top salespeople who are hyper competitive and great individual contributors aren't necessarily the best managers, and we know that, and then we try to retrofit later. So I went on my own journey to educate myself. I was very young. I think I was 23, and I read The 1 Minute Manager. And it really helped me think about management by walking around. And I still use that today in my coaching practice with teams. Are you in people's heads? Do you know what motivates them? What demotivates them? And it's so simple and basic, but we're moving fast and running hard. And we're in this era of hyper competition and globalization. And so we sometimes don't slow down to speed up. Then there's persuasion. You earn the right to persuade and bring people to your way of thinking and get them on board and inspire them when you're authentic. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Then there's this conceptualization, which is really making sure that people understand what's in your head. I can tell you throughout my career, especially running bigger teams, even global work, I was in my head a lot because I was a strategist and I had a plan, but I wasn't always good at communicating that. What is conceptual and making that practical and actionable. So I've worked really hard to make sure as a leader and now someone that trains leaders to really get the conceptual piece out of your head and into people's heads and then into their hearts so it can get into their hands. So that's the flow. Then we have foresight. Foresight is probably, in my opinion, one of the most underutilized components of leadership. Think about Netflix and Blockbuster. If Blockbuster had futuristic in their strength profile, and I'm a strengths coach, so I do a lot with Gallup and StrengthsFinder. If you know your top strengths, if you have futuristic, you're naturally wired that way to see what's next and around the corner and to be watching the markets and to be listening between the lines with your customers and your candidates and your employees, even your partners out in the market. But if not, you really do need somebody with foresight who can help you figure out what's next and what's best. And I've worked with TechServe Alliance last year at their conference to really start to think about what's coming for our space, because we all know that changes are now. They're not coming, they're here. And the way we operate within models like MSP is shifting radically. The way that we're actually doing RPO business is very different than the way it used to be done. And the whole world of outsourcing has really impacted our business, let alone things like limitations on visas. I don't mean to bring up sore subjects. This is supposed to be a pretty happy webinar. So just think about the foresight, and if you don't have it yourself, how to get help with people that are looking at what's coming so you're prepared, and then sharing that wisdom out with your teams. Then there's this whole component that you have to really think about, which is critical, which has to do with a commitment to growth. It's not just hitting it hard and going after the numbers and running. It's actually having commitment. And so do you know that people are committed? And if they are, how do they prove it? So it's like a trust but verify kind of a thing. And I don't see that a lot. I see a lot of companies doing a great job of once a year inspiration, offsite meetings, all hands, maybe a couple of times a year there's a virtual or live town hall meeting. But it's almost like there's this giant push at the beginning of the year, kind of like a New Year's resolution. And then everybody just goes back to doing things the same way. And no one's really dialed in to what's going on if people are really committed. And you can't just see it in the numbers, because even if you're having a kill it year and you're doing double-digit growth and you're happy with it, perhaps you could have done even better than that. So the commitment and checking in is really critical. And then being a steward all the time. So people that really exemplify servant leadership, they are a steward all the time. They are always acting on behalf of their organization, their commitment to their clients, their candidates, and their employees. And you know if you're acting that way or if you're not. And more importantly, you can see it in others. So it's really critical that you're a steward. And then building community. It's interesting. I just got back from an event with Paul Allen, the founder of Ancestry.com, and we're working on something called SOAR, which is a platform for leadership and coaching throughout the world. And it's based on Strengths Finder and strengths, what's right with people, not what's wrong with them. And then there's much more beyond that. But what he shared with me was so interesting. If you're a manager that really motivates people, you know their strengths, you inspire them, their engagement and loyalty is incredibly high as measured by the Gallup organization, who does all the world polling. We know this. If you're a manager that occasionally talks to your team, but you don't do it frequently, you'll get some engagement scores that are probably more in the 20s than in the 60s. If you're a manager who ignores people, your engagement scores go down to something like 11%. And I'm actually surprised it's that high. So we can't just ignore people. We've got to inspire, motivate, get in their heads. And building community is so important to our employees and to our businesses, because if we don't get out and do things to help the communities we serve, it can be really short-sighted, and then our employees don't necessarily feel like they're able to do more and give back when we're really doing well and we're benefiting from all of our hard work. It's like share the wealth and give, and then you will receive. So let's go to the next slide. So then what we talk about is how to build your own authentic leadership model. And here's where I like to bring in my own 23-year journey and the lessons I've learned. If you can go to the next slide, Caitlin. So I like to share tips, tools, tricks, and traps to avoid. So one more slide. The 5 leadership qualities that I've identified actually start with authenticity. And that's what this picture is really showing you, how to be way past transparent. Maybe you share some of your numbers. Maybe you share the message once a year. Authenticity is living it all the time with all of the aspects, either servant leadership or what we looked at earlier with Bill George's model. There are endless models. They all really say the same thing, which is be authentically yourself. Don't wear a mask at work. Be you all the time and get past transparency into authenticity, and then people will absolutely be inspired and want to follow you. It helps with recruiting, it helps with retention, it helps with engagement, helps with loyalty, it helps with referrals. You know in your business, if you're constantly having to up the referral bonus, something's not working, because people don't even want money. If they love where they work and they're crushing it and they're happy and they're engaged, they're going to bring you their friends because they want to work with people of like mind. So the next slide is a picture that really shows us the second quality of leadership, which is getting yourself in a position of getting comfortable failing. That's why this is a fuzzy view. Sometimes we have to fail. In my book, I talk about little F's in failure and big F's in failure. A big F in failure might be something like you start a company and it doesn't go and you lose it. Or maybe you launch a new line of business and you really run hard for 12 to 18 months, but you just can't get it off the ground. And in fact, there isn't a market for it, so you sunset it. A little F in failure is iteration and trying new things and A/B testing and different marketing campaigns and different iterations of existing business. Maybe you're really hot in cybersecurity, but you want to get into something else, but it's kind of adjunctive or next to what you're doing in your niche. You try it and you see what the market will bear. And the next slide, Caitlin, shows us what happens when you move from your authenticity and your attempts at trying new things and failing and getting comfortable with failure and encouraging your teams to try things so they know it's safe to fail, so that they are stretching and getting out of the box and producing new and creative things. Then we move into focus. That's why this picture is now so crystal clear. Leaders without focus literally confuse people. And so we talked earlier about consistency and conceptualization. If you aren't crystal clear, neither are your teams. So be very clear in what your rocks are, what you're headed toward, what the strategy is for the year. And then the next slide shows us clarity. So we have to be really clear and focused. So the clarity is around, if I set key objectives or KPIs or OKRs or big rocks, call them whatever you call them within your organization, apply this to you. I have to stay clear on what they are and not get squishy and not get drawn by the shiny object. A lot of founder entrepreneurs in perspective get attracted to these shiny objects because it's part of their ideation, which is exciting. It can also be really jarring for somebody to not be able to follow. Well, you said we were going to go after expanding our market this year, and now you're saying we're not doing that, and instead we're going to launch a whole new line of business. Or you said we were going to hire 50 people in certain geographies, and now we're closing those geographies down. And even if that's the decision you're making, you have to ensure with authenticity that you tell people what you're doing and why you're doing it. Not minutia, not the detail. Obviously, there are some things that are left to the executive team that it's really kind of within a vault, but for the most part, things aren't that top secret. We are not curing cancer and we are not launching missiles. Okay, next slide. And if you do all of these things, you end up with the soaring balloon. And now people are starting to really resonate together. And one more slide, you get the results. So this is what results look like. It's hard to imagine the Taj Mahal and how it was built, but authenticity, some failure, focus, clarity, and then getting people to rise together will produce the results. So those are really the critical elements of authentic leadership that I like to talk about and educate on. So let's go to the next slide. So now what I want to do, and one more slide, please. What I want to do is talk to you about how it is that you can make sure that you are not settling unless it's something that works for you. And I'll tell you what this means because it's confusing. If you're unconsciously settling, that's not a good thing. If you're consciously settling, it's in fact a great thing. It just takes practice and knowledge. So we're going to start that practice and knowledge right now. Next slide, please. So I have actually developed what I call the StopSettling Quiz and Spectrum, and you've got a link when you get the slide so you can take the quiz, and it's free and it takes 5 minutes and it's only 5 questions, but it's a quick self-assessment of whether or not you're settling unconsciously or involuntarily, which is not a good thing. A lot of times people think there's such a thing as work-life balance, and they strive to get that work-life balance. Picture this. There's this hamster in a wheel, and he or she is running a sprint inside of a marathon. So that little hamster is running, running, running. And now picture that hamster in that wheel running and running on top of a teeter-totter. And the teeter-totter is swaying to and fro, and it's really wild. And the hamster's getting exhausted, but the hamster somehow keeps going. Maybe the hamster's inspired. Maybe the hamster needs to feed its family. Maybe the hamster literally has somebody over their shoulder who's telling them, go faster, go harder, you have to, you should. Maybe the hamster had a really tough parent from the military who said there's only one way and it's a 4.0. Whatever the scenario is, if you picture that and then you put yourself into that hamster's little body, you know for yourselves and for your teams and for your friends and your family and the society and community around you and for your own health and welfare and self-care and sanity, it is an endless, endless battle and quest to hit the nirvana of perfect balance. There's no such thing, which is why I wrote the book, Stop Settling, Settle Smart, which is about blowing up the notion that there's such a thing as work-life balance and instead going for conscious trade-offs and making decisions around your priorities situationally and relatively. So my new favorite quote is harmony beats balance every time. And actually the 5 key areas of your life in harmonious integration are the way to have a sustainable model that will work for you, your teams, and all of your loved ones. So if we can go to the next slide. Okay, so You're yourself authentically, holistically. And it doesn't matter if you're at work or at home or out in your community. And if you are able to navigate your life being yourself all the time, think about how much simpler that is. And frankly, how much more believable. Let's go to the next slide. So now what happens is you have to actually understand that there's a way, there's a method to figuring out quickly and simply whether or not you, your colleagues, your executive team, your coworkers, your mid-level managers, and your entire team on the ground are actually living their authentic life, not just at work, but holistically. Because if they're not at some point, the dreaded burnout will happen. We see it in staffing all the time because it's usually fast growth, hyper paced, really competitive. You lose good people, it's unwanted turnover, and we measure things like that. Sometimes it's because they're burned out and your culture's doing it. Sometimes it's because they're burning themselves out and you haven't authentically said to them, hey, time out. You're going to crash if you continue at this pace. I appreciate you love what we do and you're all in, but an 80-hour work week is not sustainable. Can we go to the next slide? I want to give you a real world example. So there's a company that has in their signature block, a very large staffing company, they're over $1 billion, in their signature block that we actually appreciate, believe in, and provide for work-life balance. And their definition is a much healthier one. And it says, we don't expect you to work at night and after hours. And if you receive an email at night or after hours, don't feel compelled to answer it. Now that's pretty bold and very unusual for a staffing company or any fast-paced sales organization, especially in an organization of that size. But you are putting you're walking the walk and talking the talk. You're putting your money where your mouth is when you do that. And your customers see it too, because it's wired into that internal signature block that ends up being on the bottom of everybody's email. So I love stories like that where companies are doing everything they can to walk that walk and talk that talk. And it takes us out of fight or flight mode and puts us into more of a peaceful, I'm in charge of my behavior and my choice type of a scenario, which allows for that authentic leadership, and people will follow you, they will believe you, and they will go to the end of the earth for you. We have to practice what we preach. And when I started my own executive and leadership team coaching company, of course, my lovely daughters, who are now 15 and 19, said to me, oh, good, it's time you practice what you preach. So I wrote about that in my book because, boy, did they give it to you straight. And those of you that have kids know exactly what I'm talking about. So even if you think you're faking it with them, they've got you. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So there's this quiz that really helps you figure out whether or not you are conscious or unconscious, voluntary or involuntary, about the way you spend your time, your quality of life, the joy and productivity that you're going for. Again, situationally and relatively. Every single human being is like a fingerprint. We're all very individual. For example, if you've ever done strength finders or DISC or Myers-Briggs or any of those types of assessments, again, I tend to use strength finders. I find it very unique and hard to game. What I love about it is when we measure people's top 5 strengths across their ability to execute, influence, build relationships, or think strategically, their top 5 combination out of 34 possible top strengths has a 1 in 33 million chance of being exactly the same as somebody else's. So the chances are your top 5 and everyone in your organization are not going to be the same. It's almost impossible. So we are unique like fingerprints, yet so many times we aren't showing up fully as ourselves, and it might feel like there's good reason. Again, you might have really huge constraints in your business or your life. So what I really like people to do now is think about the 5 facets of your life. Your life is a gem. I'm surrounded by these beautiful gems that a designer created for me. And the 5 facets are your career or work, generations, which is just a nicer word for saying family, circle, which is your friends, And then society, which is community, might be your neighborhood, it might be church, it might be giving back, however you define it for yourself. And then finally, we have vitality, which is your health and wellness and self-care. Let's go to the next slide. And while you're starting to think about this, what I want you to do, oh, I'm sorry, Caitlin, can we launch the poll? I got ahead of myself there. Okay, sorry, I told you I'd go off the slide. So of each of these 5 domains that I just unpacked for you, would you please now go into the poll mode and take the poll? So for each of the 5 key domains, which are you currently settling, or in other words, making unconscious decisions and or trade-offs in, based on the definitions I just gave you? Your career, generations, circle, society, or vitality. And we'll give you a minute to do that. How's it looking, Caitlin?
We have answers coming in right now, so if everyone could tab over to the screen and put in their votes. We'll give it another couple of seconds.
So while we're waiting for the results, let me tell you, when you take the quiz online, there's a spectrum that comes along with this. And in each of these 5 key life facets, including work, there's a settling spectrum that I've identified and started to measure. And in fact, over 1,500 people have taken the quiz, and the results cut by demographic are fascinating and not always predictive. So the first settling spectrum choice you can make is that you are, in fact, always settling. Then that's the first point. The second point you might choose is that you are frequently settling. Again, using this definition of settling, unconsciously and involuntarily. Then there's neutral. Then as you move up the settling spectrum, when we get to point number 4, it is that you are infrequently settling. And then the top score, 5, is never settling. And there's some really interesting twists within the quiz, depending on how far you go on the spectrum, always or never. Okay, Caitlin, if we've got some results, let's go ahead and show them. Thank you.
Excellent.
And while we're waiting for those to pop up, then what we do is we talk about what is the desired quality of your life. So currently, look at the mix here. Many of you are actually settling, making unconscious decisions or involuntary trade-offs in generations, which is family, then your self-care and wellness, vitality, then society and community, and last, career. So in the quiz, we would call you careerists. You're primarily focused on career, and that probably isn't just how you spend your time. It has to do with passion and providing for yourself and your family, inspiration, all that stuff. Many times what we see in the quiz, especially for the bigger population that we've surveyed so far, we see that people do in fact spend less time on things like society and themselves. And it's not just staffing at all. It's other industries and people of different ages and races and genders and all of that good stuff for diversity. So now, do we have the second poll, Caitlin, where they can actually take it one more time for their desired or not?
No,
Okay.
Definitely they'd have to go to your website.
Okay, so let's go back to that slide that has their desired quality of life. So now with the round 2 in the quiz, when you take it on the website, you get to see where you are and where you want to be. So for example, let's say that you go, wow, I didn't realize I was settling unconsciously with my family. Maybe you do know, and it's fine the way it is. I'm not here to preach or judge. Maybe that's exactly right. But if it's not, in round 2 of the quiz, I ask you to take it one more time, but changing your mindset. So picture this for a minute. You have an endless bucket of money and a magic wand, and you can actually have any desired quality of life that you want. Back to those 5 key life facets: career, generations, circle, society, and vitality. Now, how would you answer those questions? Would you always settle, never settle? Would you stay neutral? Would you move your lever up? Would you move your lever back? That's the power of the quiz. Within minutes, you can actually see for yourself what it is that you really want. And of course, we don't need an endless bucket of money or a magic wand to get there. So now let's go to the next slide and we'll tell some stories about each of these key facets. So career. Many of us, including myself, for most of my life, have been careerists. Very motivated, very inspired, working hard, providing for our families, providing for our employees, providing for our community. And so the careerist tends to do things like make a lot of conscious trade-offs. Let me give you one example. I was coaching a young gentleman in oil and gas in procurement. I know, dreaded procurement. So everybody on the phone right now is like, oh no, she said procurement. Really good guy. Some of you probably know him. He's in my book, but he's anonymous. Some people are, some people aren't. There's some great interviews in the book of CEOs you will know and some that you don't know that are not from our space, because I think it's really good to get an outside-in look when we're thinking about how we want to build all of this authenticity and leadership. So this young gentleman said to me, and he was working about 70 hours a week and traveling a ton. He said to me, there are some bucket list items for myself that I really want to explore as I get older. And I said, oh, cool, what are they? And for him, he had this interesting bucket list item that he wanted to travel to a bunch of incredible museums around the world. And I thought, oh, the Guggenheim, or I don't know, whatever his desired museum visitation is. And I thought, oh, he travels so much, including globally. I bet he does it all the time. He probably tags on a day or he takes a couple hours. And I said, how many museums have you visited while you're traveling for work? And I wish you guys could see, I could see you, and I wish that you could respond to me and we could do a poll on this. But just think for 1 second to yourself what you think his answer was. We can make this fun, like 0 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 20, 21 plus museums. And this is over about an 8-year period. His answer was 0. 0. And I said, why? And he said, because I would never do that to my company. I would never go do something like that on their nickel. And I thought, something's wrong. And I said, have you ever talked to your manager about spending a couple of hours or taking an extra day and flying home a day later? You could offer to pay for the extra night's hotel. I said, I'm not sure they'd be upset or even care. And in fact, it's a performance enhancement for you to get a break. It might actually accelerate how you're doing. He had never thought of it. And when he talked to his manager was blown away. Now, shame on his manager a little bit, because he wasn't in his head. He was not using authentic leadership, and he was not practicing servant leadership, and he was not living the 5 domains of leadership I talk about either, because he didn't really know what his passion was. And it could have really helped him stay more connected. And in fact, he left that company. And so it's not because he didn't go to museums he left the company, but the story is so poignant because it's that blend of career and for him, which was vitality. And he had given vitality the last level of his effort, energy, and time. He traded it off for everybody else, including work, and put himself last. And in fact, that's how burnout happens and disengagement. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, family. This can be a sticky one. It certainly has been for me. I was a single mom for 10 years, raising 2 young daughters, and it was hard. And I had to make some really tough choices. I ended up hiring a nanny. I am so blessed she was with me for 10 years, and I could not have had the career I had without her, and I could not have provided for my daughters the way I was able to without her, and our rescue dogs. Those are things that are important to me. Yet with my own immediate family, we were never really that close. I moved from Wisconsin to California. I was considered very different, a little bit wild, kind of out there, have a couple tattoos. Like, that was not the way we were raised in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I went to Madison. The rest of my family went to Marquette. For those of you that understand what that means, you understand there's like an open liberalness and a conservativeness. So I was not that close with my immediate family. But what I found was that for me, blood was not thicker than water. And so I made my close friends in California, where I've now been for 22 years, my family. I adopted someone who became like a mom to me. My sister had passed away when I was 20. Both of my parents had passed away many, many years ago. And so I really was kind of on my own with my girls. So I adopted people and they adopted me, and they became a priority for me. Yet my own immediate family, including some cousins and people back in Wisconsin where I grew up, we talk, but we just weren't that close. And instead of feeling bad about it or guilty, I decided to just be okay with it. And it created a lot of freedom and space and authenticity in myself. Not in a negative way, just to be okay with, you can define family and friends however you want. Blood is not always thicker than water. And some of you are going to feel the opposite way, and that's okay too. Why does this matter at work? And if you want to go to the next slide, Caitlin. This matters at work because we bring our whole selves to work. And if we're managing and leading authentically, we know this to be true. And if you yourself have ever felt like, I can't really let people in, I can't really be vulnerable and show my heart, I don't really want to tell them anything personal about myself, I mean anything, you know that it's really hard for people to actually get close enough to you to be behind you and inspired by you and part of your inner circle. And so the inner circle sometimes does spill over from work into friendship and friendship into work. So quick story here. I coach a company who's a high-tech startup. They do some work with staffing. They're not per se in staffing. They work with lots of different vertical industries. And they have a couple of people that have met and gotten married at work. It's very sticky. There's no policy against it. They make it work because they're super explicit about it. They aren't implicit. They're explicit. So they'll say things like, it's all great. We love that you met each other here. They're a startup, and so they're working really hard and long hours, and they're killing it, by the way. And yet they said, you can't really be on the same team for certain things. And as they have been growing, actually, they have them in different parts of the organization. They have helped them consciously make a move so that they're able to work together in the same organization, but also have some space and some arm's length where it's needed for objectivity, etc. So they've created a way to work with it, not fight against it or put their head in the sand and pretend that it doesn't exist. So that won't work in every organization, but it's a great example of the blending of where harmony beats balance every time. If they were to just try to balance that, everybody can get married and everybody can work together and everybody can work on the same team and it doesn't matter, that may not work. Or nobody can get married and nobody can date, nobody can work together if they are, and we have to have you separated in different buildings if you tend to date or whatever. Like, it's the extremes that get us in trouble, and thinking that if we put an extreme out as an executive leader that people are actually following it, because they're not. And then you read the review on Glassdoor, and we already know how squishy all that is. Okay, I have to watch my time. Okay, let's go to the next slide. This is a really interesting one on society. A lot of companies give back. They go and do Second Harvest together, or they go and do Habitat for Humanity together, or they say, pick your favorite charity and we will match donations during a fundraising drive. I see it all over the staffing industry as much as any industry I work with, which is like home for me. And I love that about the staffing industry. We really are conscious of giving back. And why that matters to our employees so much is because it means we care about their causes. And we're giving them an opportunity to get outside of themselves and do something for others. And we all know it feels just as good to give as it does to receive. And in some cases, for some of us, it even feels better. So if you're not currently working on giving back into the communities that you operate in or serve, find ways to do it. And if your executive's on the call today and you don't have the answers, which you aren't going to have all the answers, get a pulse team together. I've done this with many organizations, both when I've run them and also when I'm coaching them. And a pulse team can actually tell you what's going on inside of your organization, what the heartbeat is, what works, what doesn't, how they're feeling, and where they want to serve and give back into society and community. And it might surprise you. A lot of times executives will say to me, but it costs too much. And it might not cost anything at all. It might be a half a day going out and doing a project in community. It might be an hour once a year where you have people come in and you do a food drive. It could be anything, and your employee base has the answers as to what would motivate them. And all of this is under, just like what Bill George said, the auspices of growth. because the highest performing, longest value, result-oriented companies that really stay with us the most and attract and retain the teams the best have a lot to do with giving back and being in that authenticity way of operating. And they might be settling in some places and then not in others. Okay, and then the last slide in this section is vitality. And this is so frustrating because of those 1,500 quiz takers and even you yourselves today, you can see that it tends to be close to last in terms of where we prioritize our time. And if we were to answer the question again of, are you settling versus are you not settling? We'd have to be honest with ourselves and say, okay, I probably am settling a little bit about my health and welfare and self-care, but I don't have time. Or I know I should work out, but I just don't want to. So if we can dump the shoulds, I wrote a blog recently called We're Shoulding Ourselves to Death. I hope that came out right on a webinar. And if we can dump the shoulds and actually go into what it is that we want for ourselves, here's another great story. I coach an executive and he has a gym at work, and I knew he had a gym at work even though I hadn't seen that gym yet because it's in a different part of the country and I haven't visited that office yet, even though I travel a lot. And he said to me, well, I just don't have time to work out, but I'm sluggish and I'm really I'm working these 60, 70-hour weeks and the numbers are great and we're killing it, but I just don't have any time for myself. I said, okay, time out. Is that a place you want to settle? And he said, well, obviously not. I said, well, obviously you do. I said, what about working out at the office? And he said, oh. I said, you have a gym? He said, yeah, we have a gym. I said, great. And he goes, but we don't have a shower. I said, okay, you're going to be really challenging for me today. So you don't have a shower, so you can't work out. He said, right. I said, are you a morning person or an afternoon person or an evening person? And I loved his answer because it was exactly the answer I was hoping he'd say, which was later in the day, the better. He gets going and then he's on fire and then he's a night owl. I said, so you can't work out a day or 2 or 3 days a week at the gym in your office on your way out so you can leave sweaty? And he was like, I didn't think of that. So the truth of the matter is, it's time to get real. It's time to wake up and really figure out what it is you want for yourself. And if you want more time for yourself, try to dump the excuse of, I don't have time for me because I'm taking care of everybody else. I'm running this company. I'm driving this team. It's not actually true. And here's the worst piece of it in the authentic leadership lens. If you yourself don't take care of you, you don't put your oxygen mask on before helping others, you are not leading by example in a way that you want people to follow you. So if you burn out, so will everybody else. If you say, we don't need to email after a certain time period, and if I email you at midnight, not only do I not expect you to email me back, I don't want you to, you're emailing them at midnight. Of course you expect it, especially if you're the CEO. CEO, and I've been one, it comes with a really tall order of magnitude and responsibility. People respect you. They look up to you. And in some cases, they're emulating you from everything that you do. So you can't say, well, it's okay for you to work out because I want you to feel good and have performance enhancement and be here for the long haul, but I'm not going to do that for myself. So we have to get real with these conscious trade-offs and choices. And vitality is an area that we are absolutely anemic in across every industry that I measure. Anemic. So we have to make those conscious trade-offs and not use work as an excuse. Okay, enough of the lecture. Now we have 15 minutes left and I want to leave time for Q&A. So we have one more slide. Go to the next slide, Caitlin. So while you're thinking about the commitments that you want to make, we'll start to move into your Q&A so that I can answer whatever you want to ask me and nothing's off limits. But I want you to think about one commitment, just one commitment that you're willing to make today from everything that we have talked about. Whether it's, I want to lead more authentically, I need to take some more time for myself. And maybe that's not working out. Maybe it's reading, maybe it's yoga, maybe it's meditation, maybe it's headspace on your phone. Maybe it's going and singing in a choir. It doesn't matter. Make one commitment today that you're willing to shift. And that's only part one, and that's the easy part. The hard part is share it with somebody, your wife, your husband, your partner, your daughter, your son, your best friend, your neighbor, your coworker, somebody on your executive team, somebody in the organization that you're mentoring. If any of you are mentoring, share it with somebody that you're mentoring and make that one commitment and make it visible and make it practical and make it actionable and be accountable to yourself by having somebody else also hold you accountable. And then ask them to do the same in exchange, because as most of you know, it's the one thing that really counts. Just that one incremental change that starts the domino effect towards authenticity and authentic leadership and a harmonious, integrated life, not one trying to aspire to the proverbial work-life balance that even if you hit for a fleeting second, will be really hard to get back to as you run in that hamster wheel. Okay, let's go to Q&A. Caitlin, there's a lot of me talking, and we have, I think, 13 minutes left, it looks like. Do we have any questions?
Absolutely, Dana. So just as a reminder to everyone, you can submit your questions on the question box on the right side of your screen. Just anything you'd like to talk to Dana about, we'd be happy to answer.
I'd also love anybody who's willing and brave enough, since you can see my face and I can't see yours anyway, we'd only hear your question, and I'll repeat your question, and it's anonymous. I'd love to hear any of your stories about authentic leadership that works, or even struggles that you've had with pulling authenticity through your organization under the auspices of actually growing the organization, back to that value equation like Bill George talks about. Anybody want to share a quick story? You can chat that too. So I'm not seeing anything coming in, and I know that this is a lot in an hour period, and I've kind of thrown it all at you. So if we don't have questions, instead of ending early, although we're fine to do that, let me just share 2 more quick examples with you of how authentic leadership can actually really improve the health and welfare of your organization. So I want to go back to something I said earlier about engagement and loyalty. And I can't see your hands, but ask yourself, how many of you are currently using Net Promoter Score as a measurement of loyalty for your customers? Now think about how many of you are using Net Promoter Score as a measurement of loyalty for your internal employees. And now think about how many of you are using Net Promoter Score as a measurement for your candidate loyalty. Think of that closed loop opportunity to measure externally, internally. And then think about how simple the Net Promoter Score question is, which is why when Fred Reichheld from Bain invented it originally and actually really sent out kind of an ask to the staffing industry, $3.9 trillion space globally, he sent out this ask saying, would you adopt this type of a measurement because it's simple and it's so powerful? I want you to think about his question for a minute, and then I'll make a parallel for you as to the Stop Settling Quiz and how that will help you run your business and your life, the business of life, as I call it. His question was, would you refer a friend or colleague to our organization? The or is so much more important in that case than the and. Because if he had worded it, would you refer a friend and colleague? The scores would be very different. The or turned it into a 2-part question, even though it's 1-part question. And because he said friend or colleague, he actually covered the key facets of the settling spectrum that I've identified. Because the way you define friend for some of us is family or friend, inner circle or acquaintance. Everybody defines the word friend in their own way. No right or wrong, good or bad. Then colleague. Colleague, again, some of us think of our immediate shoulder to shoulder people I work with. Some of us think about people we sit on boards with. I know I do. I sit on 5 advisory boards. I think of all of those people as my colleagues, not above me or below me or next to me. I just think of them as colleagues. And so when you have a question that's simple like that with math, it's the quantitative and the qualitative combined, it's so powerful and so meaningful and so easy to adopt. So my encouragement to you is to adopt the settling spectrum. And if you're having trouble getting in people's heads, or your managers are having trouble getting in people's heads, and you're the CEO and you can't walk around to a multi-hundred person or 1,000-person organization, or even if you're a 50-person organization and you're mostly virtual, it's hard to get in people's heads, especially virtually and especially across generations. And so I would encourage you to use the Stop Settling Quiz as an equal playing field to figure out what people really want and then have deep and meaningful conversations with authenticity about it. And wherever humanly possible, if you can help them get where it is they want to go, do it. Give it to them. It might be a very simple adjustment that they don't think they're in the right place to make, or they don't think it would be well thought of if they were authentic with you. So with that, Caitlin, I think we should wrap unless you think there's anything else. Maybe you want to bring us home here, Caitlin? I think there's one more slide just to close it.
Sure, absolutely. Oops, one moment. There we go. Here is a slide for Dana's book that she's been talking about. I also just wanted to let everyone very quickly know that our next webinar is next week, this time, 12:30 Eastern on Thursday, the 11th. And it's titled An Economic Update and Forecast of the IT and Engineering, Staffing, and Solutions Industry. That's presented by ITR Economics, so we'd be happy to have you attend with us. That registration is available on our website and will be sent out also in promotional emails that I'm sure everyone is receiving. To that end, as I also mentioned, Dana's webinar, the recording and the slides will also be available on the TechServe Alliance website and will be sent out in follow-up emails so you can reference it for the rest of time. Dana, is there anything else you'd like to add, or are we all good?
I think we're good, and I just would love to hear your stories if you want to share them with me privately. I am very easily found on LinkedIn or my email or Twitter or Instagram. All my details are listed, and I really look forward to hearing your stories and seeing you settle smart. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.